I'm Dave Laird.
I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Jim Gauer, preparing to make an infinite series of grand entrances into pocket after pocket of space here in the Great Concavity.
Oh, Jim,
See
that's
if you
one.
can spot that one.
Oh my gosh, I don't.
Page 571. No.
Is that from Wallace's philosophy thesis, Fate, Time, and Language, or something?
No, in fact, it's Tony Krauss, poor Tony.
Oh yeah.
Tony.
After he's had the seizure, and he's thinking back on the sort of grand entrances that stars would make in 1950s movies.
Oh yeah.
And he's not feeling so. This is after he's been in the Armenian library bathroom stall,
Right.
had the seizure on the bus, and then he's moving on, as we know, not towards a particularly pleasant ending, but the that description of poor Tony with a boa wrapped around him, making an infinite series of grand entrances was just, for me, it was both an example of the strange poetry of Wallace's prose, because there's no ornament at all. There's no sense that he's trying to write something poetic. He's just, the language itself is just sings. And the rhythm of it is beautiful. And it's also an example for me of this almost mystical ability of Wallace to take a otherwise completely unsalvageable human being and make the character empathetic. I mean, I think poor Tony is just for for one of the characters that's not at the center of the book is just fascinating, because in some ways, his character arc is just straight down. And,
Yeah. It's like pure objection.
At the same time, he has this kind of heroic quality of he just keeps going, and however bad it gets, it's just okay, on to the next thing. And and poor Tony is my wife's favorite side character, so it's a bit of an homage to Meredith. So,
that's
So
great.
our guest today is Jim Gauer, and as you can tell, Jim, we're going to give you a little bit of introduction and then get back to this, because last we emailed, I think you said you had not read Infinite Jest while you were writing the book. So now that you clearly have, I might have to revise my questions for you.
And I guess we should introduce what book you've written, Jim. But listeners of our show have definitely heard your name before if they've listened in the last 10 or so episodes, because we've talked about your book, Novel Explosives, quite a lot on the show. And Matt and I have both thoroughly enjoyed it and promoted it as much as we can on this show. And I feel
start
like to the bio.
of all the books, and I will say this right from the top, that says of all the books that we have promoted on the show, I think that yours is the best, and deserves the most attention that it hasn't gotten. I feel like anyone who is a literate reader, who is a fan of literary fiction and especially sprawling novels, which most people listen to this podcast are.
They're pretty down with that.
Then they would like your book. So I want more people to know about it. I want more people to discover it, and more people to read it. And it's really an honor to be able to talk to you about it here today.
Well, I'm really grateful, guys. I mean, we're not in a period where these kind of big, difficult novels are particularly popular in the sort of corporate publishing world that we seem to be living in. I mean, it's not that there aren't a lot of great novels that I've read over the last years, but the kind of you know, writing and reading as an extreme sport is not that popular these days. So yeah. So
Well,
in
I mean,
any
Wallace
case,
is at the forefront of that, and part of the reason why that sort of idea of literary genius that manifests itself in long novels is often grouped together with a white male sensibility.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, that is definitely an either outmoded or outdated or on the way out point of view. And so there's a big controversy within Wallace studies of a professor at Yale, Amy Hungerford, who straight up refuses to read Wallace. And one of her reasons is basically that idea of, she just resents the idea of like, oh, a genius, and it's some white guy who wrote a long novel. And that to me is, I don't want to go down that path too far, but like,
Yeah.
I think that it really causes you to miss out on a lot of great books if that's true. I mean,
Yeah. Well, like, you know, if you go back a bit into some of the books that really influenced me on novel explosives, you know, somewhere near the top of the list is George Eliot's Middlemarch, and yeah, and Daniel Deronda. I mean, the ability to write these, you know, long periodic sentences that don't seem to be going anywhere and then land exactly where they're supposed to. This is not a white male thing. I mean,
Sure. Sure.
it's a style of writing that yes, some enjoy or don't enjoy, but I'm not sure it should be for gender specific reasons. There are
Yeah.
a lot of great female writers, and I mean, I probably have as influences more female and I would say non-white um, influences than anyone.
yeah, I wanted to ask you about that actually, if I could interrupt, because at the
Yeah,
beginning of the book, you know, there's a lot going on with Pessoa and you know, the different identities that are popping up. But by the end of the book, I thought, wow, this guy's clearly read Gravity's Rainbow
Yeah, totally.
a couple of times.
And a great deal of
yeah.
world literature as well. Yeah.
Well, of course, you're going to get me right back into trouble talking about white male authors, but
Sure.
yeah, no, certainly. I mean, that whole string, you know, with Gaddis and Gas, and I mean Joseph McElroy, who I don't think people read too much anymore, but
Women and Men, right?
Women and Men, Lookout Cartridge, the some of the, you know, great big extreme fictions of the 70s and 80s and so forth, Gaddis and so on. You know, these were all sort of heroes of mine when I was at the time a poet, but reading a lot of novels. So yeah, Gravity's Rainbow was, you know, is certainly a touchstone, and but you know, I'd go back for the tradition that these land in. You sort of go back. I mean, you probably go back to Cervantes, but in fact, Steve Moore could probably take you all the way back to the, you know, Hellenic novels that are the
Ancient
precursors.
Mongols.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I want to come back to that, but I realize now we haven't really summarized the novel.
Yeah,
and
I was
we
gonna
kind
say.
just got a little off track on your biography, which I also want to come back to.
Yeah.
I think that the book, there's probably a really short synopsis that doesn't do it justice. And I feel like any, you know, lengthy 500, 600, 700 page novel is difficult to summarize. But
Sure.
Dave, do you want to try to summarize it?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. So we have here a book that sort of has three strands, I would say. The first begins with a man waking up in Mexico and has no idea who he is or anything about his own personal history, but he has a great deal of knowledge about the world and about culture and about poetry, etc. And then we have, contiguous to that, two kind of hired gunmen characters who are down in Juarez, Mexico, and their aims become clearer as the book goes on. And we have also a venture capitalist from California who waxes quite poetic in memoirs about a great deal of things, from wine to poetry to Gramsci and all kinds of Marxist and post-critical theory type stuff. And as any good sort of mega novel does, these strands eventually become, I'd say, more clear throughout the novel and sort of coalesce into an ending that is, satisfying and fascinating to see how all these big pieces come together at the end. So we don't want to spoil too much, but I think that's kind of a quick overview. Would you say that's reasonable, Jim?
David.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Give you 3 stars for that.
4 out of 5 stars.
4 out of 5.
The funny thing is if you turned it into a linear narrative, the book takes place over the course of a single week in
Right.
2009.
Yeah. The week
beginning
right after
in
Easter.
the wee hours just after Easter,
Right.
April 13th, 2009, and ending the following Monday. If you could do a 3-sentence linear description of the story, it's actually a fairly simple story.
Right. Yeah.
But the way the story gets told, which to me is always the more interesting part of a novel in any case.
Yeah.
I tried to stick to a pretty simple story. I mean, it's a venture capitalist who gets involved in a venture capital deal that it turns out has drug money behind it. He kind of discovers that there's something weird going on with one of the investors in the deal. Finally gets told to give his profits back, and heads down to El Paso to not so much to return the money, but really to figure out what's been going on, and kind of gets drawn into this, eventually gets hit over the head and wakes up in Guanajuato with no idea who he is. So the straight story is, what's interesting about that? It's on the other hand, if you move the pieces around a little bit and start with the guy waking up in Guanajuato with no idea, with his knowledge intact, but no idea as to who he is, that's a somewhat more interesting place to start. And then to kind of expand on that, to get rid of the usual trope, which is the man in search of his identity. In this case, our character who's been handed a kind of phony identity, a Scottish driver's license in the name of Alvaro de Campos. Rather than being in search of his identity, he doesn't want to know anything about his prior identity. He'd just as soon leave it as it is and live in Guanajuato in the moment, in just with the beauty of the world. So in some ways, he's fleeing his prior identity rather than pursuing it. So anyway.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on there with identity and also time and space and cosmology. And like you just said, the way that the book is structured is saying something itself about the nature of time being lived backwards in a way rather than forwards.
There's more than a little Proust at the bottom of that, in case you were wondering.
Yeah, and I think structurally too, like there are some elements of this book that remind me of Infinite Jest in the way that things are ordered, certain things coming before others, and kind of a like it's a really fun puzzle to solve this book, I think. In a way that Infinite Jest is also a fun puzzle. And I think I haven't had a chance to reread Novel Explosives yet, but I can imagine that rereading this book would also be very deeply satisfying in the way that I find Infinite Jest to be as well. Because then you have sort of all the pieces
alone.
Oh yeah, too. Yeah. Speaking of the sentence level, Jim, would you mind if I give a few? I've picked two excerpts from the book. Can I give our audience sort of an example of the kind of prose that we're talking about here? Would that be okay?
Please.
Okay. So there is a sentence in the book that is about 2 pages long. That while I was reading it, my jaw was just incrementally dropping further and further, because the way that you just continue to add to this sentence for 2 pages was amazing. And I actually said to Matt about a month ago when we were thinking about this interview, I was like, would it be cool to read this sentence to give the audience an idea? And he was like, yeah, let's do it. And then so I tried reading it to Rachel, my wife, and after about a page, she was like, okay, okay, that's cool. Yeah, I get like the vibe of what's going on here. And so I decided to sort of shrink that down a little bit, condense it a little bit. But the sentence is amazing. So this is a sentence kind of towards the end of the novel that's describing an RPG explosion, a novel explosion, I guess you could say. So this is on page 674, and here's the description. The world being everything that is the case, suggestive of a world where nothing is sacred. This is talking about the explosion. Its world being anything that isn't the case, the world being many things that shouldn't be the case, the warhead shattered, scattering a cloud of pale gray particulates, heated by the warmth of a Comp B fireball, heated by their own intermetallic reactions, heated to the ignition point of a white-hot particulates, the immense front car on the black-draped train, leaving the boots on the ground, something on the order of zero point 0.4 milliseconds to get their final affairs in order, pack their luggage for the black train's departure, and make any last few microsecond arrangements to prepare to leave the gray zone's blue skies behind and prepare for a sky gone thermobaric white. So that's an explosion, and there's some characters who are about to be, consumed, potentially in that
blackened
moment.
by the whiteness. Maybe.
And wow, what a gorgeous gorgeous piece of literature there.
It's probably worth pointing out that novel explosives are an actual category of explosive, as hopefully becomes clear in the novel, and they are actively used. They were actively used in Iraq and Afghanistan
by the U.S. military.
By the U.S. military. Yeah. Their actual composition is supposed to be top secret. I did the research on actual novel explosives, which are made up of strange combinations of nanoparticulates. So nanotechnology being down at the atomic and molecular level. So this is a category of science, if you can imagine it, called lethality enhancement. And
wow, that's gross.
What kind of world do we live in that we need a whole category of science called lethality enhancement? But the purpose of them is to take an ordinary RPG that would normally have an explosive like RDX, for example, that sets off a pretty good explosion. Take the same thing, surround it with these fine-grained particulates, kind of on the model of how a Kansas wheat silo explodes when grains of fine-grained powder go into the air and get ignited with a spark.
Oh, okay.
It's the exact same principle. You take these very fine-grained particulates, suspend them in a cloud, and then set it off with an RDX explosion, and it makes a huge thermobaric wave, and that means both huge heat wave and huge barometric overpressure wave that kills people without leaving a mark on them. And this I find particularly eerie since I've seen photos of the after effects of novel explosives being used in Fallujah. So this is, in some ways, it sounds like a kind of magical, imaginary thing. In fact, it's very real and disturbing when you read these. So I don't actually know what's in the RPGs that we were using in Fallujah. But as you know from the novel, I make a lot of I do a lot of speculating about what could be in them. All of those are taken from patents that the lethality enhancement scientists have filed on different combinations of nanometric particulates that could be used to create massive explosions. So very strange research in the patent office. Anyway.
Yeah, no kidding.
Well, and I want to make it clear to our listeners that some of this, like you're saying, is a critique in a way of this idea of lethality enhancements. Just like I think that a lot of the discussion of venture capitalism is, in a way, a critique of the system or the forces that could bring about the sort of conditions that the characters find themselves in. So it's not, I mean, and maybe I'm mischaracterizing that, but it's not so much to me that you're taking pleasure in the fact that these explosives exist as like the fact that they could be used by really almost like a non-state entity with the drug cartels.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was my take on it.
Yes, to be clear, as is noted on the back of the novel, this may sound like a joke I invented for the novel, but I am sort of known in the venture capital industry as the world's only Marxist venture capitalist. And
That's
so
a great description.
the kind
I love that. And actually, I want to ask you a little more about that because one thing that really stuck out to me in this book is the fact that capitalism and capital now is so sort of concealed by these obscure balance sheets and shell companies. You know, the currency isn't really physical, although in this book there is a huge duffel bag full of currency. Right. But there's all these extremely complex, financial instruments in this huge global economy. The scales are massive, and the pirates, the raiders that are able to get to it, can really get to staggering amounts that they couldn't in any other time in history, and still fly under the radar. You have this great thing about what kind of VCs or hedge fund managers can make $1 billion, $2 billion in a year. They just came out with a new list. Ray Dalio's at the top of it, and it's like these guys making $2 billion a year. It's just absolutely staggering. But, my question for you is like, besides just like raising awareness of this issue, is like, you live it. Is there anything we can do to stave this off, or are we really just fucked here?
Man, I wish I had a good answer for that. It's, the problem is we're in this phase of hyper-capitalism where the flows of money are themselves monetized in massive ways. These hedge fund managers that make, I'll leave names out of it, but some of these guys, one of them runs a hedge fund called Renaissance, if you can imagine, Partners, has made at least $1 billion or $2 billion a year for 25 straight years. And all of this is done with computers. There's absolutely nothing socially productive that comes of this. This is not being invested in factories and building things or producing food or
jobs
right. Or helping to save the planet from climate change. And, I hope it's clear that the perspective that this is ultimately being written from is we live on this miracle, in this vast cosmos with virtually nothing of interest in it, other than that I happen to find the cosmos kind of fascinating.
Sure.
But we live on this spinning blue jewel of a planet that if we're not careful, we're going to consume it to death. Mm-hmm. And so this hyper-capitalism, all of the things in the book that are critiqued come back to this. We have to do something to save this miracle that we live on. Mm-hmm. And that's maybe not the easiest problem to solve, but one of the things from my perspective is we need to be more aware of how hypercapitalism has gone completely amok. It's the money accelerating in an accelerating fashion is going into fewer and fewer pockets. I use the example that one hedge fund guy made the median US family income every 2 minutes, 52,000 every 2 minutes, 365 days a year. And and then the year that followed that, he made the gross domestic product of Nicaragua.
Jesus.
What is there something wrong with this picture?
Right.
Capitalism itself has gone into lethality enhancement mode.
Yeah. Even from that quote I just
I,
read, suggestive of a world where nothing is sacred,
Yeah,
to describe the way that this explosion occurs, right? Like, it's so misanthropic. It's unbelievably
yes,
misanthropic, and I can see that principle also applying here in this context too.
yeah,
well, and some of the bleakness for me is maybe the context is a little different because I know you wrote this before Trump was elected. But there's a big part of the novel that takes place underneath a bridge in El Paso, and I'm thinking while I'm reading the book now that bridge, we have like a temporary concentration camp built underneath that bridge, and we've got this asylee refugee problem from countries like Nicaragua, that we have completely impoverished, and in a way that the global scale, that I think your ability, you have an advantage as a VC in a way that not all writers, maybe none that I've ever read before, can really create a compelling story out of a business deal and tie that back to the sort of socioeconomic implications of what's happening to those people there. And I'm wondering if that this is a very unique novel in that way, and like what was sort of informing your politics? Has it changed before or since 2016?
Well, there's a line in the novel where, the character affectionately known as douchebag is noting a time when Anapra, this completely impoverished area to the west of El Paso, is about 40,000 people that live in hovels, things that are built out of basically out of the garbage dump of Juarez, or one of the three major garbage dumps in Juarez. And I spent far too much time in Juarez researching this. Anapra is a complete mess. If you go back 30 years, Anapra was one town that was both US and Mexican, and kids in Anapra went to school on the American side of the border, and the people, US citizens who lived on the American side of the border, went in to shop in Anapra. And the character observes that was before they built the fence and declared it illegal to be Mexican. And that effectively is what Trump has now hyped up into. It's not only illegal to be Mexican, it's illegal to be Latino, it's illegal to be anything that's other than, white male dominant. And this is a horror for me.
Well, and a lot of those guys who are VCs, actively voted this stuff in, or hedge fund managers, let's say, in order to save a buck on their LLC or S corp that they have filtered money through for a deal. I mean, the trade-off between taxes and literally everything else, or tax cuts and everything else, it seems pretty stark when you put it, up against a town like Anapra, right? Like a trade-off for humanity versus like a tax cut.
Yeah.
That seems very stark to me.
Yeah, you can't even imagine how big the tax cut was for the hyper-capitalists, if I can call them that, because one of the things that they did was to lower the taxes on what used to be ordinary income for hedge fund managers and the guys that run like Bain Capital, the the kind of income that they produce in terms of fees is now taxed at like 10%. I mean, you look at Mitt Romney's tax returns. I don't mean to pick on Mitt. He actually pays way more taxes than Trump does, but he averaged paying a tax rate of 14%. Now, I personally pay my taxes. In fact, my tax attorney said I pay more tax per dollar than anyone in the U.S. And she probably would know. I pay like
Voluntarily or
55
otherwise?
cents on the dollar because I think we need to pay our taxes and contribute to the better good. But it's staggering if people had a little more financial literacy or a little more insight into what's actually going on with where all this money goes. It's really horrific. I mean, many of these guys, and you don't see them on the Forbes 400 list. The guys on the Forbes 400 richest Americans and all that are just people that want attention. The guys with real money don't even show up on that list because most of their money's stashed offshore, and they only pay taxes on whatever they need to bring onshore to pay their bills. And yeah, it's
Well, and a
a
lot of that was
nightmare.
exposed in like the Panama Papers, and it seemed like that expose or even like raising awareness of it really did nothing to change the political system or change a damn thing except for actually get them more tax cuts and ability to store more offshore.
Yeah,
So
I
that's
mean,
pretty bleak.
if you keep me on this topic, we'll be on for hours.
So
No,
let me switch gears though and ask you, because this is a good point to ask you. You mentioned earlier that before writing fiction, you were a poet. And I want to back up a little bit because we had a link to your appearance on Bookworm, where you were talking not about your book, but about Guy Davenport and Hugh Kenner. And you were a student of Hugh Kenner's. And I want to ask you about that point in time of, were you actively writing poems, and like, could you foresee the point in your life that you are at now back then?
yeah. So I started writing poetry while I was working at Rand, specifically their defense unit called RDA, building a model of nuclear war against the Soviet Union. That's kind of briefly mentioned in the novel
As
in
a
passing.
mathematician, is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I was given a year and 4 or 5 guys to help on this. I had to build a model of nuclear fallout, and I they said they were going to test my solution against this 5 foot stack of data. So I was trained as a mathematician. All mathematicians are inherently lazy. So rather than actually trying to build this from the ground up, I started looking for patterns in the data and kind of reverse engineered the data. It took me about 2 weeks to write this one long equation that reproduced every data point in the 4 foot stack. And because of the kind of contract we had, I was told to look busy for another year. So I started writing poetry and reading. And seriously, that's when I started. I was 21 at the time. So from then on, I was essentially a poet trying to make money at computer science. My mother was a great computer scientist. I grew up with skills in real-time operating systems, that kind of thing. And so when I got to a certain point, I thought, I got to go back and get kind of the history of literature. So I had done a lot of reading, but I went off to study with Kenner at Johns Hopkins. I was publishing poetry at the time in Paris Review and Poetry Magazine and a variety of other places. If people are interested in the poetry, you can Google Jim Gauer poetry and you'll see the poetry, which was going to be a book that I was going to publish in the 80s and then decided not to. But the poetry is all there.
Had you tried a memoir as well? You kind of allude to the poet in the novel who contemplates writing a memoir of the sort of venture capital industry called Tales from the Crypt.
Yeah.
Was that
the inside
did you
story?
Consider that?
No, that was just a gag. That was totally made up. The VC writing the inside story of venture capital was just a gag. But when I was studying with Kenner, I was a poet. Eventually, Kenner stumbled upon my poetry about a year or so into my studying with him and told me to leave. He said, tell me one academic who's written great poetry and I'll let you stay. And I said, well, off the top of my head, I can't think of any. He said, get out of here before it destroys your poetry. But what I was working on with Kenner was the topologies of literature, and I won't even attempt to explain that. But
I don't know what that word means.
A topic that only Kenner would come up with. He's the only English academic who's actually written a math book. He and I had endless hours talking about homeomorphisms and isomorphisms, and there actually is something to that. But I came to believe that mathematics as a language and the language of literature are two fundamentally different things. If I try to explain that, we'll go off into a long philosophical discussion, but just a flavor of it is that the fundamental basis in novel explosives for why there are so many different discourse worlds, all of these worlds of military discourse, of monetary discourse,
wine is a major one.
Lethality, of
wine.
Wine. I tried to put as many different discourse worlds in there as I possibly could, because the fundamental assumption is that language, self, and world are ontologically intertwined, that there's no such thing as language by itself. That's kind of the illusion of the dictionary. And I mean language in the broadest sense of systems of signification. There's no such thing as the world just by itself, and there's no such thing as the self just by itself. All three of these are intertwined, and specifically dialectically or dialogically intertwined. I won't go too much deeper than that, but part of the reason for all these discourse worlds is to try to make the reader gradually aware that, wow, the discourse world that I live in, everybody goes off to work. And I mean, you know this, Matt, because you work in a certain discourse world. They all talk the same way. They've got a certain language that they work in, and everybody lives in these isolated discourse worlds and speak a language. And the self that you are within that discourse world and the way the world looks through that discourse world is kind of one unified ontological intertwining of things. So for me, if a reader came away and said, I better watch out for what discourse world I'm trapped in, like, am I trapped in the discourse world of consumerism, for example, or of a military discourse world that finds X, Y, and Z to be good causes to go to war, or the war on drugs to be something worth fighting because we have to go get these narcotics guys, while failing to recognize that we're the ones that are consuming all the drugs and funding the whole thing. yeah, be careful of the discourse world that you may be trapped in.
Well, let me tell you, that's one thing I really love about this book is that a lot of, this is your first novel, and a lot of first novels are written by people in their 20s who have not lived in any of those discourse worlds or studied them for years and years and years. And I think it's really refreshing for me to read a novel by someone who has spent time on the ground, clearly in the places that you're writing about, but in the worlds of whether it's finance, whether it is military grade explosives, whatever you're writing about, you have not skimped on giving those discourse solutions. And that's some of the appeal of Wallace, who is also a mathematician. Yeah. So I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you about, well, he wasn't a mathematician so much as he had studied analytical philosophy, which on paper can look like straight up math problems.
And
so
symbolic logic
symbolic
as
logic,
well.
right.
So which is the basis for computer technology. So yeah, so he may not have been a pure mathematician. There is a lot of mathematics in Infinite Jest, however. So it was a discourse world he was interested in.
The eschaton sections particularly are heavy on that.
Yeah. Or
so
fast Fourier transforms, for example.
So you said you didn't read Infinite Jest or Bologna before you wrote the book, but now you have read Infinite Jest, is that correct?
Yeah, I was afraid in advance of writing the book. I was afraid
of the anxiety.
I had a sort
influence.
of advanced anxiety of influence over resulting from two books. I knew that Bologna's 2666 was going to deal with Juarez and the feminicides, or femicides as they're now called, the murders of women, which at the time Bologna was writing were thought to be the result of perhaps a mass murder on the loose. And I knew that Wallace was interested in many of the same things that I am. So Wittgenstein, symbolic logic, and math adjacent kinds of things. He was a dictionary reader, which I've been since I was a kid. And I started seeing all of these interests we had in common. And I thought, oh my God, if I read this book, I'm never going to escape the influence of it. And it was kind of funny that when I finally got done with Novel Explosives and read Infinite Jest, it's like, oh yeah, he's got all my words in there. That's cool. Teratogenic clouds. Yeah, that's kind of good. Well, I use teratogenic a different way, but that's all right. And I was kind of relieved that the novels didn't feel too close to each other. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, they're similar to me in the sense that they both do a real deep dive into some really specific subcultures. And there's a lot of kind of code switching between them throughout each book. And like you've got some huge sentences in this book. Wallace has some as well, but there's a great deal of distinction between your work and his too.
Well, in both books, I think in some ways are funny.
So funny, and absolutely.
I'm so glad you said
there's
that.
There's great moments of levity.
I
in
thought
this
I
book.
was going to sound strange if I said that, but
there's a lot of that kind of humor that is, especially from the first person point of view. Maybe you can talk about writing this. Is that clearly? It's more fun to write if you're having fun, and that comes across in at the sentence level or the language of it. But I thought there was a lot of times where I just and there's some metafictional elements too that are similar to Wallace, where you're sort of addressing the reader. Do you want to talk about that? I mean, you mentioned you're influenced by people who were maybe metafictionists in the 70s and 80s, but
right.
I mean, did you just find yourself saying, fuck it, I'm going to throw that in, or like, why not?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was kind of an homage. I mean, we're 40 years past the time when metafiction was central to the way people were writing. I mean, I think Gass coined the term in maybe 1970, and so the sort of heyday of metafiction was 60s, 70s, something like that.
Right.
So it was more homage. Yeah, let's put some metafictional elements in that. That's part of the history of the novel. Let's put it in there. You know, I there are some people that read the book and thought, well, that's kind of retrograde, or he's trying to go back to um, a time that we've moved beyond. Well, I don't think we ever move beyond anything in literature.
Right.
We
Yeah.
whatever resources literature can produce, let's use them all. Why
Yeah.
not?
Well, in a similar reaction when Wallace's posthumous novel, The Pale King came out, and there was a big metafictional element to that book, and people thought, really, he's going back to this?
Right.
Like, I thought
Yeah.
he had moved beyond that, and so there was definitely, I don't know if it's confusion or misunderstanding of the role of, or what Wallace took to be the role of metafiction. But I want to ask you about another similarity you have, which is that uh, a big advocate or champion of Wallace's work was Stephen Moore,
Yeah.
and especially instrumental in bringing Wallace out to Illinois State University while he was finishing Infinite Jest, and published David Markson, who wrote Wittgenstein's Mistress, published a lot of other history of the novel books, and then his latest collection of works is also from Green Integer, Zero Gram Press. So it was quite surprising to me as a reader to see Stephen Moore blurb with your book and advocating about Bookworm. To me, that's imprimatur of like absolutely by sight unseen if Stephen Moore tells me to do it. So I want to ask you about that connection because it just seems too good to be true.
Yeah. What happened was when I finished. So, Novel Explosives is actually my second novel. I wrote a first.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. There's no reason you would know it since I stuck it in a drawer. But the first novel is called Nigerian Scam. And I wrote that, stuck it in a drawer, and the next day sort of heard the voice of Alvaro speaking and started writing Novel Explosives, and then spent the next 7 years writing 5 6 hours a day starting at 3:30 in the morning on Novel Explosives.
And then going to your day job as
at
well,
the
right?
at the end of it, yeah, and then going
Wow.
on to work. The At the end of it, I was going to stick it in a drawer, and then I thought, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't do that. I was coincidentally at the time reading Stephen Moore's history of the novel. In fact, I can tell you exactly where I was. I was in the Spanish Golden Age and reading about Quevedo and Cervantes and all these great writers of the early 17th century. And I I stopped for a second. I said, I wonder if Stephen Moore is like a real person. It's and so I Googled him, and I actually found his email address, and so I just cold emailed him and sort of explained that I'd written this novel. Didn't know if it was worth anything, but would he be willing to read it? And so I got a message back from him saying, yeah, I'd be happy to take a look. I should warn you that most fiction these days, I get 30 pages in and just close it because it's not very interesting. And so I sort of, closed my eyes and mailed the manuscript off to him. And it arrived, and that night he started reading. And then about 4 in the morning, I got an email from him. I mean, I was awake at the time. I'm now on
Working on your
page
third novel?
225. This is brilliant or
Oh,
something. And
wow.
so Steve basically at the end of it said, you have to publish this. Now, it turns out coincidentally, I'm sitting in the apartment of my editor, Pablo Capra, who we should mention here.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Pablo.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So Pablo had read the book. He took it to Doug Messerly, who is the publisher of Green Integer. Before that was the publisher of Sun and Moon Press. A long 40 years in the publishing business. And Doug, kind of on Pablo and Steve Moore's recommendation, agreed to publish Novel Explosive. So that's kind of
That's
how
a
the
great
book
story.
came out. Yeah, without Steve, it probably would have ended up in a drawer.
Wow.
Wow, that's a great story, and
Yeah.
anything that he champions, like I say, I think his voice carries a lot of weight because he's had such success as a publisher, and he also has this interesting connection back to the Hugh Kenner, and that he worked on that collection of letters, the 2-volume Questioning Minds of Hugh Kenner and Guy Davenport, which I just bought a few months ago, and I'm taking my time. It might take me several years to go through that book, but it is truly a treasure. And I think Steve indexed it in a record speed, and is a sort of polymath type person. So I was very happy to see that endorsement. But it's just such a rare thing, like Steve says, to get a novel that, because we get sent books occasionally, and even I've been a book reviewer for 20 years, and so I've reviewed a lot of books, and sometimes I'll pick one up off the shelf and say, "Huh, I should read this," and then be like, "Oh, actually, I here's the review I wrote of it." I don't remember a damn thing about it.
I think it would be hard to forget Novel Explosives, though.
Well, and we love to be able to find, because Wallace isn't writing any more books. Anytime someone writes a 1,000-page novel or 800-page novel that's called an encyclopedic novel, my instinct is to try it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they are of wildly varying quality. And one question I have for you is, writing in all of these different modes. What did fiction allow you to do that you could not do with poetry or with writing about in not prose, nonfiction?
Yeah. Well, um, the way my poetry progressed was, so, first of all, I'm at heart still a mathematician, which is uh, not necessarily apparent in the book itself, but it's a kind of way of the joy that I find in writing is the same joy I found in problem solving in mathematics. So the way I went about writing poetry was to make it increasingly difficult to write. This is one of the things mathematicians also do. If you've solved a problem of a certain difficulty, the last thing you want to do is go back and solve a problem that's easier than that. So you
Right.
continue to increase the degree of difficulty. And what I ended up with in the poetry was I'd stripped away all poetic effects, all kind of ornamentation. If you look towards the back of the collection of poems, you'll find about 5 or 6 poems that are bare of almost everything. I mean, there's almost nothing left there but the self and language in some kind of interaction. Not Beckett exactly, but really severely stripped down. So when I set out to write the novel, it was, I have this huge lexicon. I'm going to just spend it all because I hadn't been able to spend it in the poetry.
Yeah.
I was so intent on limiting the means by which to produce poetic effects that it was, this is freedom. I'm going to just let it loose. And that sense you have of the sentences being kind of, you know, discoveries that the readers make, that's exactly how they were written. I would sort of put myself in a difficult position linguistically, a difficult setup to a paragraph, and see if I could write my way out into a coherent paragraph. I had a pretty good sense of how the whole book worked and how it fit together, but no sense at all as to how the pieces would be written.
Hmm.
So I would take a character up to a certain point and then, peer in the window and write what I saw there. So the way the sentences work, and I think Wallace, I get the sense when I read him that he was doing the same thing. He didn't want to write the sentence before he wrote it. It's not plotted out. It's let's discover this together. And, it's what makes Wallace magical. I don't mean to compare our work. Wallace is a, grandmaster, and I don't even want to put myself in the same league. But
I think it's a fair comparison, though, Jim.
Yeah,
I'm comparing it.
Yep.
I'll compare it.
Happily.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm not, but in any case, I'm grateful. I'm grateful. But
We appreciate your humility.
what you get in that sense with Wallace is you're constantly discovering, wow, where did that come from? And I think David's joy in writing, when he still found joy in writing, which I think he made increasingly difficult to do with Pale King. When he still was in that joy of writing mode with Infinite Jest, he was having those windfall moments of, wow, look at this. Where'd that sentence come from? And then weaving those together. There's a quote from Ravel that I love. It's about his piano concerto in G. And Ravel says he listens to the adagio section and says, wow, it sounds so flowing. And I wrote it bar by bar, and it nearly killed me. And that's kind of how Novel Explosives was written. And with Infinite Jest, you get this sense of every sentence was, risk it all. It's just to be able to sit down with a book and just make discovery after discovery. I'm talking about Infinite Jest. It's just, it's just magical and fantastic.
Yeah.
So.
Another comparison that I would make between these two books that we're talking about specifically is that, and this came up on your interview with Michael Silverblatt on Bookworm, is there's this great moment in that interview where Michael Silverblatt's talking about how you've written a novel here, Jim, about like the impossibility of life and the rapaciousness of humanity, but ultimately this book leads us to generosity, kindness, and even faith. It's a moving procedure and one we don't really kind of expect normally from this novel. That's what Michael said to you. And I see that so much in Wallace too, in Infinite Jest. And then there's kind of like a soteriological, salvific kind of thread throughout both of these novels that is, deeply human and compelling and philanthropic ultimately. So I think, if you're talking about payoff of fiction, like it's great to read a book that's really smart and funny and all those kinds of things. But if it lacks, sort of that question of humanity or enriches our sense of humanity somehow, Wallace would say then that's not really art or good art. And so I think Novel Explosives does that in really profound ways as well. In the way that Wallace does.
And are you using Easter as part of that as well, like the salvation part?
Yeah, well,
the rebirth.
Yeah, so if it's deliberately started after salvation's taken, that's the day before. We've had salvation. Now what?
Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of lead the novel up to this somewhat obscure next holiday, which is Divine Mercy Sunday, which is actually more Eastern Orthodox holiday, but kind of transplanted into Mexico. And so Divine Mercy Sunday is the day when even the most hardened of sinners can be forgiven their sins. So what we have is a kind of the week after Easter, but still that some path to salvation. Salvation for me is, yeah, it's how do we learn to love one another in a way that saves the planet? It's and Dave, I have read your thesis, by the way, and
You have? No
I'm
way.
glad you brought up soteriological and instead of me, because I probably would have mispronounced it. But
I can't
yeah,
believe you read it. I
the
just
self,
briefly included it in one of our email correspondence. Like, oh,
yeah.
here's this thing that I
When
wrote
I
about.
started the
Wow.
book, I had a great many things that I was angry about.
Hmm.
And as I worked through the book, the attempt was to find, okay, how do we salvage? How do we find salvation? How do we stand in the world in a way that will preserve the world for the generations to come?
Hmm.
How do we save the planet? What orientation in the world brings language, self, and world together in a way that's intertwined and has a something beyond the self, something beyond greed, something beyond war, something beyond human idiocy in all its forms,
Hmm.
and something well beyond lethality enhancement. And so as I was writing, I was raised as a Catholic, but dropped out of Catholicism when I was 7.
Hmm.
Somewhere in
That's
there is
pretty early.
probably still a Catholic. But I would mention, you know, Gramsci specifically found common roots to Marxism and Pauline
Hmm.
Christianity
Hmm. Yeah, that's not
in
hard to
that
see.
attempt to, you know, save all of us, to
Yeah.
save the way this is put is actually earlier in the book that if we're not on the side of those who are left behind in the process by which capital reproduces itself, where are we? So, in some sense, the novel is trying to find out where are we? How do
Hmm.
we find a place to stand where we're on the side of those that are left behind in this process by which capital reproduces itself and consumes our planet along with it?
Hmm.
So there is really my wife is quite religious, and she assures me that this is a religious book and I should just consider it that way.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah,
Yeah,
you said to Michael Silverblack that it's not a specifically theistic book, but that you draw on a lot
yeah,
of things that you consider to be sacred, and I think that really comes across. And I liked that
right.
you said that you started from a place of anger writing this book because it's clear that it is like a righteous kind of indignation that
Yeah,
that pushes this novel.
yeah. Uh, yeah, I will will spare you the sources of that anger, but I have seen the world of
Yeah.
hyper-capitalism up close and personal, and it's ugly. It's going to destroy the planet, and we need to stop it. So
I just want to add one thing on that point that I get particular. One of my hobby horses is Jeff Bezos's idea that the only thing good he can do for the planet is to like build space travel so we can leave Earth. I find that really like upsetting
Yeah.
and actually like offensive.
Hmm.
And as much as possible, I try to rail against that the absurdity of his claim because his $100 billion that he is just sitting on could actually do a lot of good.
Hmm.
yeah,
I don't want to, like you say, I don't want to make the whole show about this, but that I would be remiss if I didn't mention the absurdity and stupidity of that particular line of reasoning.
yeah, insane. I mean, the conditions under which this planet came to exist at just the right distance from the sun in just this solar system with just the right atmospheric conditions to produce some form of life, and then to produce eventually a form of life that's actually sentient and ought to have enough sense to be a shepherd of the incredible miracle of our planet. The fact that people with money would say, oh, yeah, let's build a means of escaping this. Where? Where?
Yeah.
No, this
Yeah.
is it. This is the one chance we've got. So, yeah, sorry.
No, I'm with you. And before I forget, I feel like we had tons of questions. Like the book is so dense. There's like a million directions we
There are a
could go
lot
in here.
we could,
But
yeah.
one thing, if we don't get to the last thing I have for you to ask before we wrap up is a question. You seem to have really enjoyed writing this book. Are you still writing? Are you still enjoying it?
Yeah, I'm sort of the Rilke school of writing. You don't do it unless you have to. Yeah,
I
it's
ascribe to that model as well.
yeah, I I think there's another book, but yeah, I mean, one of the things I didn't want to do was put my head down and look up 7 years later and go, wow, what happened? Because
Hmm.
I was in an intense zone of absolutely living the novel 24 hours a day for 7 years. I needed a bit of a break to refill things. And if I have to write another one, I will. And probably it will be because something that I didn't think of in novel explosives pisses me off, and it's time to start writing again.
Yeah, I like
That's
that.
great.
Yeah, anger as a catalyzing force
Yeah.
for
Well, I hope
social
we gave
justice. Yeah,
David Foster Wallace his due here. I mean, he's really one of my heroes, and we do a whole other episode of my thoughts on Wallace and in various ways. I have. It seems like large portions of this book stuck permanently in my brain, and
sure.
as
Yeah,
I'm sure you guys do.
yeah, definitely.
And man, I'm really proud of you guys for doing the podcast and keeping the conversation going. I mean, it's really important because if these kinds of books just fall off the radar, they'll come back, but it might be another 50 or 100 years, and the conversation needs to continue.
Hmm.
And you know, I don't, I should just mention that one of the big influences for me in writing novel explosives was specifically a black writer, Machado de Assis from Brazil. If you've ever read the posthumous memoirs of,
I
yeah,
have it right here on my
okay,
desk, in
Wow.
fact, today.
yes, okay. So if you know
Anyone
Machado
would?
de
It's Matt
Assis,
Booker.
Epitaph
wonderful
of a Small
writer,
Winner. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and uh, yeah, I don't care color, gender, wherever it's coming from. This has nothing to do with gender as far as I'm concerned. It's you know, let's think big bold ideas and not succumb too much to the restrictions of corporate fiction. They have to make money at books, and I realize there's not big audiences for these kind of bigger books, but as long as we keep the conversation going, I think that hunger is still out there,
Yeah.
and it'll come back. So.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. You mentioned that there are a few moments from Wallace's writing that have really entrenched themselves in your psyche. Can you share one or two of those anecdotes with us?
Well, some of the, I mean, you can't escape the Gately dream sequence at the end. However much I've had to work through sort of decoding what
Yeah,
Wallace had in mind for an ending to the book, which I
totally.
have my own version of, which I'll spare you. The party where Joel, tries to commit suicide is just, I don't know, so vividly written that As much as I'd like to escape it, I can't.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
as I mentioned, several of these that that scene in the where poor Tony is stuck in the bathroom trying to survive on codeine cough syrup and slowly coming unglued is I'll never get rid of that one. And
Yeah.
I say that as though I want to get rid of them. No, they're magical moments, and there's 25 others I'll think of as soon as I get off
Yeah.
the phone. But
No, those are good
anyway,
ones.
yeah,
Actually, yeah, it's
he's a
funny.
wonder.
Yeah, I have a colleague, the school that I teach with. Him and I just co-wrote a new English 11 course for our school this year. I've been doing that for about the past 6 months, and I injected as much Wallace into it as I could. And as a result of him and I working on this together, he messaged me about 2 weeks ago saying that he picked up Infinite Jest from the library and he started reading it. And he was kind of on the fence about it until he got to Molly Notkin's party and Joelle Van Dyne having too much
Is that
fun.
right?
And he said he was absolutely like in it for the long haul after that
Hooked
scene.
him.
That's
Yeah.
the one that did it for him. Yeah, because before
Yeah.
he was like, I don't know what all these characters are. This is so diffuse and everything seems to be so disconnected. And then that scene just absolutely hooked him.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, Wallace's willingness to let these strands go off in this kind of dispersion and then slowly pull them back and weave them together.
Hmm.
You know, it takes a lot of courage as a writer to do that. And as Steve Moore would tell you, he was one of the first to see the original manuscript. He and Michael Peach each got a copy of it, as you probably know the story of the manuscript. It was about 4 inches thick in this microscopic, 6-point font that was single spaced and on both sides of the page and all that.
Uh-huh.
Uh, you know, the well, I'll leave it at that. The willingness of Wallace to let these strands go out, confident that
Yeah.
he can then bring them back together and make meaning for us. Um, yeah, it's a heroic book.
Hmm.
Heroic book.
That's
So,
great. Um, Obviously, there's hours more things that we want to talk about with you, Jim, but we don't want to take too much of your time on this lovely Sunday afternoon. What I'll do is in the show notes for this, I'm going to link to your interview with Michael Silverblatt on Bookworm, which is
okay.
excellent. You did a great interview with I-94, which is a radio show out of Chicago about a year ago, April last year, I think it was.
Yeah.
We'll link to that as well. So if people want more, and I'm sure they will, go listen to both of those. And are there many others out there?
No,
Those are
no,
the
it's,
okay. So
you
we
know,
found them all. Okay, good. I
hopefully
feel
over time, I have a lot of patience. The book's not going anywhere. It's,
yeah, totally.
I want to offer to our listeners too. I'm going to offer a satisfaction guarantee on this book that if you buy the book after today and you are not satisfied with it, email me your receipt and I will refund your money. I'm going to offer a full satisfaction here. I am confident that everyone who appreciates Infinite Jest will
Yeah,
love this book.
totally.
And I've never said that on any other book, but this one I guarantee you is worth every penny of it. And all of those years of you working, Jim, I just want you to know paid
Yeah.
off because I think it's a phenomenal book.
you guys are way too kind. And Matt, if there are people that particularly love the book and would like I did, we did print a cover version of this. If people particularly like the book and would like to have a copy of the hardcover for whatever reason, it's kind of a pretty object, and
It is
you can give
gorgeous.
them my email address and just feel free to write me, and it's no cost. So
Wow, amazing.
Well, I guarantee you that I have foisted the book on several people, and one of them in particular sends me he underlines sentences in the book and posts them on Instagram.
Oh, yeah.
And he is absolutely in love with every page of it. So I mean,
sure is.
to me, I've gone back through it because I finished the book last summer, and I wanted immediately, like when I finished Infinite Jest, I wanted someone to talk to about it. So I'm really hoping that having you on the show here today gets us more people that we can discuss the book with, because I think it's that phenomenal, and
it's kind of selfish
I really
of
look
us,
forward to. Yeah, it's totally selfish. I mean, Dave, you recently finished it. I mean, how did you feel when you finished the book?
Oh yeah, like I had that similar kind of feeling of elation when you wrap, something like Infinite Jest or The Instructions by Adam Levine, which is another book that I would put in this category.
Right.
And yeah, you're just like, the puzzle is so fun to solve, and you're thinking back on it. And I kind of ran some of my thoughts by you, Jim, via email about like how are these connections.
You had it right. Yeah.
Okay, so I was mostly right. I was affirming. But yeah, like at the sentence level, this book is a blast to read. Thematically, the humanity of it is phenomenal, and we could talk more about all the depth of research that went into this. You talk about it quite a bit on I-94, so your trip to Juarez specifically, you talk more about there. That's a good place for people to check out. And I will say too that, and I mentioned this in an email to you, that I'm very thankful for all of my years playing the video game Call of Duty, because I was familiar with so many of the weapon names that you include, like the SMAW, the SCAR, AR-15, and a host of others. And I was like, oh yeah, I know what that gun looks like. Cool. I've used that.
So everybody's clear. All that weaponry is not in there because I love guns. It was me trying to figure out, why do we have a gun for every man, woman, and child in the United States? What is it? There's some kind of fetishistic appeal to weaponry that we in the United States have been overcome by, and it's not good for us. But in any case, if anybody thinks I have a gun fetish at the end of reading this, that wasn't it. Anyway,
yeah, no, I didn't think that. It's like, it's descriptive, not prescriptive. I would say a lot of the things in this book are,
But it kind of shows some of why the fetishistic appeal of it. And the research I did on all that was going on a lot of chat room sites with people whose fondest wish is to have somebody walk in their front door so they can blow them away. I mean, it's truly frightening. So, but all that said, let's step back, and I really appreciate you guys keeping the conversation going.
Thank you, Jim.
Around novel
so
explosives, around Infinite Jest. You guys are heroes, huh?
Oh, thank you, Jim. It's really kind of you to say. The feeling is definitely mutual.
Can I leave the listeners with one more quote from your book?
Please.
Okay, so this is from page 680, and this is a few pages after the quote that I read at the top of the show. And this is sort of about as the explosion is. I mean, it takes quite a few pages for the explosion to actually resolve. And the description throughout is absolutely brilliant. But here's a particularly human moment that I took from it. So this is from 680. All things considered, as we await the final outcome of Ray's last mission, we might let Gomez share a final thought. Something from his list of Shakespeare quotations, self-evident and apposite, while signifying nothing. Although with Alice seconds left before the shock front arrives, he'll certainly need to keep it brief. It's too late now for that quote from Macbeth, full of walking shadows and dusty death and blowing out brief but enormous candles. It's far too late to wash our haunted hands and take to our beds in spotless nightgowns. And as for that last syllable of recorded time, we've already heard it and simply moved on to somewhere deep in the book of Revelation, where the Almighty sits in judgment on all mankind and throws the whole book, final syllables and all, onto the pyralized heap of man's version of creation. And to that I just say, holy shit, Jim. You have written a gorgeous piece of literature here.
Wow. I love it.
Yeah, it's so great. So Jim, obviously, thank you so much again. We've got just a few other housekeeping items. We want to thank our newest Patreon supporter, Tommy Quertaro. Jim, if people want to check out any of your stuff online, where's the best place they can go to buy your book, contact you, anything like that you want to share?
Where's the best place to buy it? I mean, I'm not even going to say Amazon out loud, but
Can people buy it directly from Zero Gram Press on
yeah, I
online?
mean,
Okay, good.
go
We'll link to it.
shop at a local bookstore,
Yeah,
and if they don't have it, have them get it for you.
yeah.
Unfortunately, I buy far too many books, the same way we all do, let's face it. But I like to support our local bookstores, and the book does have a large distributor consortium,
Yeah.
Ingram, and is available in local bookstores at least here in the U.S. and
Yeah,
hopefully in
here in
Canada.
here in Canada too. There's a bookstore downtown in Victoria that my sister-in-law bought the book for me for Christmas from.
I hope everybody buys it from a bookstore, but otherwise, if you're like me and don't mind doing the horrible thing and giving Bezos more money, you can get it on Amazon. So.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. If people want to get in touch with us, Matt, where can they find us?
I think we're concavityshow@gmail.com. We always like getting emails.
We do.
Even if we don't respond to them in super timely fashion. Dave usually does. I do not. I'm very slow with emails sometimes, but we're a Concavity Show on Instagram and on Twitter. That's pretty much it. I guess we have a Facebook page, but
we don't do a whole lot over there.
we don't do a lot on Facebook. But
Yeah, so people can find us there. And as always, we want to thank Robin O'Neill for her art, for our podcast icon, and the band Parquet Courts for the music. Jim, we want to thank you so much for being here and also for sending us those signed hardcover copies that you mentioned. That was so lovely to receive in the mail from you. And I also have a note here to thank Pablo Capra for being your sound engineer and for hosting you at his place for this recording and for editing your excellent book. I just want to say too, Jim, that I've really appreciated and enjoyed our email correspondence over the past 2 months. I guess we've sort of all been talking leading up to this, and it's definitely the most robust and extensive and generous discussion that we've ever had with a guest prior to an episode. So thank you for that. It's been wonderful.
Anytime.
And I hope we can keep the conversation going.
It's been fun.
Lovely. Well, this has been episode 47.
Well, I hope you guys got what you needed here.
We and more.
Into darkness, I thought to be extinct.
And then I noticed we're like an hour and a half in. So.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
It's always how it goes. It goes quick. You think, how am I going to fill up an hour of conversation? And then you get to an hour and a half, and they're like, I haven't even got to all my questions.
I still have lots more here, and it's like, well, we gotta resolve at some point. Yeah.
Well done, guys.
Seriously, thanks for being on our little podcast.
Yeah, we so
it means a
appreciate
lot
it.
to us, and like we really hope that people go out and buy the book. So even if you see a little bump in sales, I will be very happy. That's my goal, is to get the book in people's hands. Totally. So
it's funny, we
I think it's really just phenomenal, man.
Yeah. We had a contest a few episodes ago, Jim, and the guy who won it is a good friend of ours named Chris Ayers, who's done a lot of like really cool artwork around Infinite Jest. He did like a whole host of James Incandenza movie posters and an eschaton map and stuff. And all the prizes that we had to give away for the contest, he like made them himself. He like designed them. So we were like, well, what do we give this guy? And he was coming to Victoria to visit, and I was like, oh, I have an extra copy of Novel Explosives now. I'll give you that, and we'll go for beers, and I'll buy you some beer or whatever. He's like, I actually just picked up Novel Explosives and for this trip, and I'm reading it on the plane like right now. And it's like, oh my gosh, that's great. I'm glad.
Well, and actually, I got another story like that. My coworker, who I talk to about books every day, he's always asking me like, what are you reading? What are you reading? What should I read? And I told him a while ago, hey man, you got to get Novel Explosives. And he has a friend who he runs with, who's always asking him for book recommendations, and he told that guy to buy Novel Explosives, even though he had not even read it yet.
He's like, I have it on good authority that you should read this book.
When the book came out, Steve Moore wrote me, congratulations. Now, in about 7 years, the book will be known by a select group of people. And, patience. So.
2 or 3, 4, 5 years. It take a few. Wallace complained about this when Infinite Jest came out. All the reviewers didn't really get it because they're reviewers and they had to read the book in 3 weeks or 2 weeks to read the book. And it's like, it takes longer than that to truly digest this book. Yeah. And people who read it that quickly, it takes a while. Some people who might really love it, it might sit on their shelf for a year before they actually read it.
Yeah.
And it could be another year before they read it. Yeah. And then...
Well, we have a friend in common, Christine Harkin.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Cool.
Christine is an old mate of Meredith, my wife. And
cool.
Christine read Infinite Jest and dropped out of Silicon Valley and went off to, start writing and get her master's. And she's back now in Silicon Valley, but she was the one.
Christine and I were on a panel together. We were actually on a panel together at a Wallace conference in New York City at City University in 2009. That's how I met her. And we were the only two there who were no institutional affiliation. Yeah. We were just there because we were independent scholars. And so they put us on the same panel together. And we really bonded over, Wallace was only dead less than a year by that point, or around a year. So it was still very fresh in her mind.
She gave us a great tweet the other day about how it's not too late for us to change the name of our podcast to The Great Convexity.
It's concavity.
It's concavity.
Awesome. That's been an ongoing joke for the last
I don't want to be
47
sitting
episodes.
atop the convexity,
I thought it's just nice to say hi though and get a face to face to start off.
Yeah, can I just say I'm really excited about this, man. I'm really it's a really truly a pleasure to meet you, even over the shittiest program in the world.